Hello, I'm Yousef Munayyer, head of the Palestine-Israel program and senior fellow here at Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and your podcast host.
Hey everyone, I'm Yara. I'm an assistant professor of global health management and informatics and a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center.
I'm Rami Khouri. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center and a distinguished fellow at the American University of Beirut.
I'm Hanna Alshaik, and I'm the Palestine Project Coordinator at Arab Center, Washington, D.C.
Welcome everyone to another Hiwar episode of this podcast. Hiwar is the Arabic word for dialogue or discussion, and in each of these episodes, I, along with Arab Center colleagues, discuss some of the big issues of the day. Of course, a lot has happened since we last spoke, specifically open war between Israel and Iran. That included direct American strikes on Iran. This is, of course, something that comes as the United States was at least ostensibly engaged in some kind of negotiations with Iran towards resolving disagreements around Iran's nuclear program and compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And just before, of course, the Israelis launched an attack on Iran, the United States was scheduled to have their sixth round of talks with the Iranians in Oman. And so, of course, once those attacks began and this war on Iran started, the diplomatic option seemed to go out the window. We're really happy to have with us today, joining our group, Dr. Assal Rad. Assal is a historian of the modern Middle East and specifically of modern Iran. So we're really glad to be able to lean on your expertise today. Assal, and of course, she is the latest non-resident fellow joining us here at the Arab Center, and we're very glad to have her. So maybe, Assal, we can just start with you to get something of an update on what happened, what the situation is on the ground, especially during the time of the attacks, and yeah, take us through what people on the ground in Iran lived through those terrifying 12 days.
Well, thank you for having me and have me join this important conversation. First, I think the context of the way that you described it, the fact that Iran was engaging in negotiations with the US, that's very important context. But I would even draw that out further, and remembering the fact that Iran had already negotiated a deal with the US 10 years ago now, which limited its nuclear program. This is according to non-proliferation experts that work in the space, an unprecedented international oversight on any country's nuclear program that ensured Iran's nuclear program remained civilian as they say it is. And so now, who withdrew from that deal? The United States. We wouldn't actually be having these conversations or in this position had the US not withdrawn from that deal in 2018. So that's an important context to understand the sort of Iranian side and the Iranian psyche moving forward in any conversation that has to do with how we will move forward from this 12-day war. So in that context, Iran was attacked by Israel. Israel is obviously a country that is currently carrying out a genocide in Gaza, continuing its decades-long occupation and oppression of Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. It is still occupying land in Syria and Lebanon, carries out attacks on Lebanon and Syria or anywhere it really wants, whenever it wants. And I paint that picture because it's also very important context for the fact that they started yet another war by attacking Iran. The international response to that, not surprisingly, was exactly what the international response was to Iran when it was invaded in the 1980s by Iraq. And that was to not recognize the actual aggressor. In this case, the way that it was framed in the West is that Iran was condemned for retaliating, and Israel's attacks on Iran were described as self-defense. Now, on the Iranian side, this is extremely bizarre because of the context we were just talking about. A preemptive strike on Iran would require Iran to be an imminent threat to Israel, meaning Iran was about to attack Israel. There's zero evidence of that being the case. In terms of how this affected things on the ground, what we saw very early on from Israeli officials, especially Netanyahu, was the idea of calling on Iranian people, very similar to the language he used in Lebanon, right? When Israel invaded Lebanon, it was, this is not against the Lebanese people, despite the fact that they killed thousands of Lebanese people, but this is not against the Lebanese people. This is about Hezbollah. And that means that Lebanese people should rise up against Hezbollah. Of course, this did not happen. Same thing in Iran. It was, this should be, Iranians should rise up against the government that they hate. That's not the reaction we saw. The reaction we saw was people on the ground, rightfully so, being scared because they were being bombed. Civilians were being killed. Apartment structures were falling in the capital city. Iran's civilian infrastructure was attacked. Its oil fields were attacked. Hospitals were bombed. So all of this is to create, first of all, a clear pattern in Israeli behavior, but also a framing in the West that painted Israel as acting in self-defense, did not clarify that Iran was retaliating against Israeli aggression. And then on top of that, a very fearful situation on the ground where people were told by the US president that 10 million people should evacuate Tehran, a basically impossible task. This instilled a lot of fear in the population. You had people who were trying to leave gas stations that didn't have gas, so they couldn't leave. Resources that were already limited becoming more limited. So that's not conducive to a political movement that would overthrow a government. A revolutionary movement is what theoretically that they're calling for if it's happening internally. And you could see that there wasn't really an appetite for the notion of external regime change. Instead, you saw the predominant view in Iran was even people who are opposed to the Islamic Republic were still very much rallying around the homeland and the idea of defense of the homeland because they were under attack.
Yeah, and I want to just go back and tease out a little bit what you started with, which was the diplomatic agreement, right? The JCPOA. Obviously, that was an agreement that was struck back in 2015 between Iran and the P5+1 or the EU 3+3, whatever parlance one chooses. And at the time, of course, there was plenty of opposition, right, to that approach. And the people who opposed that approach continuously told us that, well, to say that the alternative to the JCPOA is war is an exaggeration. It's not true. And lo and behold, here a few years later, after, of course, the Trump administration unilaterally backed out of the JCPOA back in 2018, where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves seeing that war has not only taken place, but it also seems like it's going to be an option that both Israel and the United States are going to reach back for instead of diplomacy. So I guess what I'm wondering now is, what did this resolve? We still have this question about Iran and its ambitions as far as its nuclear program is concerned. There's questions now about whether or not it will remain within the NPT. There are big questions now about its relationship with the IAEA. And we hear all kinds of different estimates about what was actually damaged by these strikes, whether or not Iran can quickly reconstitute if it wanted to a program, and so on. So what did this actually solve?
Nothing. So we can just start off with that basic answer. It's resolved nothing. But there's so much to unpack, and I'll try to do it very briefly about what you just said. First of all, if you go back to, it's very rare that we have a situation where there's like a policy debate and you actually get to see what happens when you do both things, right? Usually you go with one policy, you don't go with both policies and see the results. So there were two major threads of thought, or two major threads of opposition to negotiating with Iran back during the era of the JCPOA. One was that one argument was exactly what you just said, which is, well, this idea that the alternative would be war, that's an exaggeration, that's hyperbole. They're trying to scare you when really, we have a better path, which was clearly not the case. So we've seen that come to pass. We've seen that debunked by the actions that the US and Israel just took. The second opposition to the deal that was debunked as well, because the deal actually did come to pass, was that Iran would not negotiate with the US. Iran could not be trusted to abide by a negotiation. We know that that's not true because Iran did negotiate, agreed to it, and abided by that agreement. And you can just ask the first Trump administration whether or not they abided by it, because that administration certified the deal multiple times before withdrawing from it. So clearly Iran was in compliance with the deal. We know all of this. So the arguments that are made that are in opposition to diplomacy have been debunked factually. Now, when we talk about what was resolved and why I say nothing was resolved, there's been a dramatic shift in public opinion in Iran over the last 10 years. Because, I mean, if you just take a moment to think rationally, if you're the Iranian population and you're sitting here thinking, well, we tried negotiations, we tried the diplomatic path, we allowed inspections, well, we are signatories to the NPT. Our neighbor that is actually extremely aggressive and just attacked us has nuclear weapons, doesn't allow inspections, is not a signatory to the NPT. What's happened is while the JCPOA in 2015 was wildly popular, I mean, you could just Google and see all the videos of people coming out and celebrating. Now there's a shift towards maybe if we had a weapon, we wouldn't have been attacked. And so the calculus within Iran is changing, not because of their ambitions for a weapons program, but because it's forcibly happening because of the actions of Israel. And now Israel argues that Iran is a security threat. This is Israel's argument as to why these actions had to be taken out. And that's what they resolved. And they talk about it as a victory because they, set back Iran's nuclear program. The reality of it is Iran is not a threat to Israel's security. Israel is a threat to Israel's security. It's Israel's actions that cause insecurity for the state of Israel because they make other people insecure. You cannot shred international law, bomb your neighbors, not respect any notion of sovereignty, carry out a decades-long military occupation, and then say your security is at risk because of this other country. It's Israel's hegemony that is at risk because of Iran. And bringing this back to the nuclear point, Israel does not want a strong Iran. It doesn't matter who's in power. They can point to the Islamic Republic, and the Islamic Republic makes it very, very easy for them to do so because of the rhetoric that they use. But Iran's nuclear program started under the Shah, under a pro-Western monarchy. That's when this program started. And when the Shah wanted to have essentially the program that the Islamic Republic has continued, a civilian program that was independent, that they could enrich themselves, it was rejected by the US. Why? The monarchy was not an existential threat to Israel. It wasn't a security threat to Israel. The threat is Israel's edge, its military edge, its hegemony, its ability to say, we are the most powerful country in the region because they are allowed to have a nuclear arsenal and no one else in the region is allowed to have that, which would create a balancing power. They don't want balance, they want hegemony. And that's, I think, one of the main issues to consider when we talk about this idea of anything being resolved. It won't be resolved until you address Israel. You cannot address Iran's non-existent nuclear weapons program without addressing Israel's actual nuclear weapons program, Israel's actions in the region that are a constant source of instability.
So thank you so much for breaking that down. I mean, it seems to me that not only did this not resolve anything, it's actually actively made the situation much worse. Because now go try to convince the Iranians that the diplomatic path is even worth pursuing. And as you noted, they're probably more convinced than ever that they should have had a nuclear deterrent. But I want to focus on this question of hegemony now, and I want to bring Rami in and others into the conversation as well. Rami, if you're sitting in other parts of the Arab world, and as Assal laid out for us, the Israelis, of course, couch everything that they're doing in this language of self-defense and needing to protect themselves. But one only needs to look at the reality. This is, one of the most powerful militaries in the region. They not only have nuclear weapons, they have first and second strike capabilities. They have the backing of the strongest power in the world, who is increasingly preparing to deploy all of its military assets for whatever sort of latest adventure the Israelis are going to go on. And not only are they not interested in making peace with the Palestinians and constantly taking and colonizing Palestinian land, but they keep adding more countries to the list of countries that they're bombing and that they're invading. And so, there was a time where maybe you could pretend that American and Israeli hegemony in the region was not really what it was not really as pronounced, was not really as much of a threat in the region. But that's impossible today, right? And so if you are sitting in Riyadh, or if you're sitting in Cairo, or if you're sitting anywhere in Istanbul, anywhere else in the region, and you're watching this mad rogue state basically do whatever the heck it wants. How are you thinking about your security? How are you thinking about a future in a region without directly addressing this ever-growing threat?
Well, thank you for that. And thank you, Assal, for your powerful introduction, which makes us more concerned than ever. But this is the world we live in, so we have to deal with it. I think really what's going on, and this Iran war, or the Israeli-American joint attack on Iran and the war between them, coming after the genocide in Gaza, which was also an American, British, Israeli joint operation, it really clarifies beyond any doubt that what we're seeing is, first of all, nothing new in the context of the last century. That since 1917, you've had the British, the big power in the West, directly aiding the Zionist movement to dominate Palestine and take it over. And then after 1945, it was the Americans, the most powerful Western power, that working directly with the state of Israel to dominate the region. So this is a continuation of a century of Western imperial Zionist Israeli joint hegemonic implementations, couched in all of the explanations that Assal mentioned and others, that it's self-defense and they're attacking us and we just have a little bit of land, and all of these arguments that don't really convince many people except senators and congressmen in the U.S. and a few media people here and there. So it's really, this is the rebirth of a colonial tradition, modernized for the current situation, I think. And it's something that the Arab states, unlike the Arab people, but the Arab states, the governments, have never been able to handle this, to come to terms with it, to engage with it, to defend themselves from the dangers that it represents. The Arab people have tried to resist and to oppose it and to express their disenchantment with all of these things that they've been subjected to by Western powers and Israel, but the Arab people have proved to be powerless. So you end up with a situation where the Arab governments, and this started again with Gaza, even before it started in Lebanon several times, and Syria. So the Arab governments try to balance things out. It used to be you balance the Russians against the Americans in the days of Nasser, but now you try to balance out the Chinese and the Turks and the Iranians and the Russians and the Europeans. The governments lay low. They just keep their head down. They can't really do very much. They try to make themselves look inconspicuous. They try to mediate when they can. The Arabs suddenly, after the Qatari lead years ago, have decided that they want to be conflict resolution specialists. And then most governments are keeping a closer eye on their own people because they understand, with the polling evidence that's there now especially, that there's massive resistance among the people of the Arab region to what Israel and the U.S. Are doing. But most of all, the big lesson to me is that what we're seeing is the unveiling of the essentially thin or erratic, or in some places non-existent, Arab state sovereignty. These are not sovereign states. They just do the best they can to protect themselves. I don't know what we don't want to call them vassal states, because they're not vassal states. They're not colonies. They're not protectorates. They're a little bit all of these things together. But the Arab state has not functioned very well as outside the oil states that could feed their people well and educate them. Most of the Arab countries have been unable to respond to the fundamental human needs of food, education, shelter, medicine, and opportunity that Arab people want, and most of all, dignity as citizens, as people with rights. And then this conflict has highlighted all of these things in one fell swoop, and the Arabs get together and they make a press statement, and it's really pretty sad. But this is a kind of low point for Arab identity, Arab political identity of the last century, and I think better days are ahead. But nobody knows how that's going to happen.
So now let's, and I would invite others to chime in here. Let's take the flip side of that question now. Let's say you're sitting in Tel Aviv, right? And let's say that the tap from the U.S. and England is never going to shut off, right? You can always count on that flow of support and weapons. I don't know that that's true at all, but let's just grant that that's the case, right? And I know that there are some folks, obviously, among the Israelis who, for them, it's a fanatical religious thing, and they're willing to, fight and have their children fight and live in a state of war forever because, it's a sort of divine command or whatever. But I think there's a lot of folks who probably don't. And I wonder if you're sitting in Israel and you're looking at the region around you and you're thinking, if you're even thinking about the fact that, the Israeli military has committed the crimes that they've committed in Gaza, and that there is no shortage of animosity surrounding you because of everything that you've done, you've continued to do. And now you've opened up this new chapter with Iran for the first time. How many people are thinking through this and thinking, yeah, this is a great idea. Let's sign up ourselves and our children and their children for a life of this forever? Does that make sense? Or how are there folks who are not thinking about the broader implications of this moment and what it means? Because, the way I see it, Israel does not seem interested in being part of the Middle East. They seem interested in dominating the Middle East and being masters of everybody else there. But that's going to come at a cost, right? It has to come at a cost. And so how is that making sense? How is that making sense to people there? Why do you think we're not seeing more opposition to policies of endless war?
I think it's confounding, but we do have one sign about what the internal picture might be like in Israel, that recently residents of what is referred to as the Gaza envelope, these villages, towns, kibbutzim, cities that border Gaza, have been ordered to return home and are told that they are not going to be eligible for government support in terms of either reconstructing damaged parts of their communities or whatever sort of stipends were issued to them during this war. So there have been heavy costs on the Israeli economy and the Israeli budget during this war. We know that the residents of northern Israel were ordered to relocate during the participation of Hezbollah in the early up until about a year ago. And this has created a huge budgetary strain, and there was a great deal of internal conflict about insufficient financial support from the government. And this is important because I think we talk about this endless stream of foreign funds and foreign military financing to massacre Palestinians, but there are still very real economic strains within Israel. So if we set aside the question of what is our place in the region and what is our responsibility to this being in harmony with the region that we're a part of, or diplomatic overtures or gestures of friendship, forget all of that just for a moment. There are real tensions within Israel, not ideologically, not about the principle of whether or not warfare is good for Israel itself, but how it's affecting people's daily lives. And I do think that some of these tensions are starting to come to a head. And so this is, I think, another question and another matter that we should be keeping our eyes on. What's happening internally, and will at least these strains on warfare be something that finally propels people to action to end this?
Yeah, and we see this as well with the conscription question inside Israel, of course. I guess the way that I think about it is, the Israelis have this horrible euphemism that they've used for their policy towards Gaza over the last decade or so prior to the genocide, which is what they call mowing the lawn, right? This idea that, well, there's really not a whole lot we can do about this situation to fix it. It's just that we have to periodically bomb it to kind of set things back, and then we're inevitably going to deal with it again as the so-called grass grows. But it seems to me that this is an approach now that they've just expanded not to Gaza, but really to the entire region. If you're signing up for implementing that strategy and having your kids implement their strategy and your grandkids implement that strategy, I don't know, it doesn't seem very promising to me, especially if you've got the opportunity to relocate somewhere like Europe or the United States, which many Israelis have the opportunity to do. I don't understand how it makes sense to folks.
Well, and to add a bit of data to this, Yousef, there was a recent poll, an Israeli poll, that showed that the vast majority supported the strikes against Iran, and that since the strikes began, public trust in the military, including the IDF, and the government has increased by not insignificant numbers. And we also see really, frankly, frightening public polling when it comes to after almost 2 years now, the Israeli public's view of what's happening in Gaza and what should happen to the people in Gaza. The vast majority support expulsion of the Palestinians in Gaza outside of Palestinian territory. And so despite all the evidence, despite everything you all have said about the long-term consequences of this, good or bad, despite the overwhelming evidence that so much of this is motivated really by Netanyahu's willingness to do anything to protect his political career, the people of Israel are telling pollsters that so far they're okay with it. So I think that's another complicating factor that we have to consider.
Well, it's a scary thing, too, when you think about it. I mean, obviously, prior to October 7th in 2023, there was a sense of almost invincibility, right, among the Israelis that they, would be able to dominate others, including the Palestinians. And that took a major hit on October 7th. And I think we saw that in Israeli society because there was almost a shock, not just about what actually took place on the ground on that day and in the days immediately afterwards, but that it was even possible that such a thing could happen. How could it even be possible that such a thing could happen? And now it seems that the Israelis have moved in the extreme opposite direction. Not just the aura of invincibility has returned, but it's kind of gone on hyper overdrive. And the scary part about that is no one's restraining them. And no one is telling them, no, you can't bomb this country, bomb that country. And this is why I wonder about the rest of the region and how many of them are thinking, what's stopping them from going after us? And that can't be good for the long-term stability or security of the region on any side. I do want to bring us back to Gaza, though, and Yara, I do want to ask you. We have seen just a continued stream of horror coming out of Gaza. The last time we talked about this, new aid system that was concocted by the Israelis and by the Americans to try to circumvent the traditional channels, which they have long opposed. And we, were very concerned when we initially talked about it, precisely because we thought this was going to be used not as a humanitarian tool, but really to assist the genocide. And since then, we have seen repeated massacres at these aid sites, which of course were denied by the Israelis, denied by the military, denied by their supporters. And recently, we even saw a big expose in an Israeli newspaper, in Haaretz, that quoted Israeli soldiers and Israeli commanders saying, yeah, we were basically given free rein to fire on these masses of people queuing for food which we were basically using as bait, and it was totally fine. And we were using live fire as crowd control. So, I mean, how do we wrap our heads around this? And how does this stop?
How do we wrap our head around this? I can't, frankly, and I hope I'm never able to, just because of how absolutely I can't picture, honestly. And over the course of recording this podcast, which has started since October 7th, almost every time we talk about some sort of new low, new atrocity, something horrific. And this is honestly among the worst things I've ever heard. And many humanitarian agencies have agreed. So because we already spoke about it, I won't get too in depth about what the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, quote unquote, is. I encourage your readers. There's been a lot written about that, including at the Arab Center. Since we last spoke, they have continued to only operate 4 distribution sites, all of which are in central or primarily South Gaza, as compared to the more than 400 that were operated by the UN throughout Gaza. So first of all, we already had this almost immediate fear that this was to be used as a tool of ethnic cleansing, to force starving people to go from where they were able to stay in the north, where they were somehow able to hold on for all this time, but now essentially to starve them to the south, which is where the Israelis want them to go. So that fear has manifested. We have seen mass displacement to these areas and significant violence when people are trying to evacuate. But it's not just been massacres, Yousef. It's been basically near daily massacres, almost constantly. And it's really a testament to how this is covered, that although Palestinians, victims, witnesses, medics, and journalists were all telling us that it was the Israelis firing, it wasn't really until an Israeli newspaper quoted Israeli soldiers saying that that's what they were told to do, that people started to actually believe this. And still, we're hearing a lot of pushback that the Israelis would never do this, despite their own admissions. They basically admitted that if someone came early, they would be shot at. If someone came after the site closed, they would be shot at. If they looked suspicious, they would be shot at. I think one of the soldiers in the Haaretz expose investigation said, our form of communication was gunfire. So there was no loudspeaker, there was no announcement. You can't come here, the site is closed. And it's important for your listeners to recognize that the site's closed randomly and irregularly. So you have this massively displaced population, very few of whom have regular electricity, internet access. They're not exactly able to check a website to see if the site is open. So they were doing what they thought they were supposed to be doing, which was going to these sites, and many of them were not coming back. People would send their children or their parents or their siblings to get food, and that person would frequently not return. And eventually it got to the point where it is now, where people are either too hungry to even attempt the journey because they're starving and they've been starving for weeks or months, or they would just rather not get shot and killed while attempting to get that food. Because even if you do get to the site and you do survive, there's no guarantee that you leave with food. The parcels are very disorganized, irregularly distributed. I've heard reports where they were just open for 1 hour in the mornings at some points. So it's more than 500 Palestinians have been killed attempting to get aid, potentially more. We know that a lot of what we know is undercounts. And just, I believe today or yesterday, more than 170 NGOs, prominent humanitarian and human rights NGOs, including Oxfam, Save the Children, essentially called for this mechanism to be dismantled and for control to be returned to the UN distribution system. As imperfect and problematic as many have found that to be, at least it was not these killing fields, as the Haaretz report found. And I just want to end with a slightly self-indulgent quote of a piece I wrote for the Arab Center last month about this very issue, called Hunger in Gaza and the Ongoing Weaponization of Aid. It is difficult to imagine a strategy more cynical than the current one executed by Israel. It has facilitated starvation in a besieged population under constant bombardment, engineered the complete capture of the humanitarian mechanisms that can aid them, forced them to leave their homes for the chance of securing that aid, and attacked them when they did, and then created a system of voluntary, quote unquote, migration for those who survive, all while openly declaring the intention to settle the land once they're gone. That is what we're seeing. That is what is happening. Unclear why that's not being reported that way, and how does it stop? I genuinely don't know. I think there's been some indication that with attention kind of pulled to the direction of Iran, there was pressure taken off Israel by its international allies to manage the hunger crisis or to not kill quite so many Palestinians in the process. But I know there's been new rumblings of a ceasefire that we're going to talk about probably next. So maybe I'll postpone for that.
Can I just add something here, Yousef?
Go ahead, Rami.
To follow up on what Yara said and your question of, where does this end, and to link it to what I said earlier, that I think what we're seeing really is a reconfiguration of the colonial experience. And the colonial experience in most of the world ended, but it took sometimes decades, sometimes a century or more. And it ended through a combination of popular resistance, sometimes armed resistance, passive resistance, international pressure, embargoes, sanctions, all kinds of things happened together to end the colonial experience of the French in Algeria or the British in Kenya or other places. And it's possible that something like this might happen for Palestine. If you look at public opinion trends all over the world, they're going against Israel, for Palestinian justice, for equal rights, for the rule of law. But the critical thing I see now is, and this goes back to what Assal said, which is the Israelis are destroying international law and the international system, the UN, etc. And they're not. They say we don't play that by those rules anymore. The Israelis only want the US to be the one who sets the rules with them. And this is what the British did for 40, 50 years. And now the Israelis are doing it with the US. Most of the world will not accept that, but it's not something that can be changed very quickly. And what you're seeing is Americans just yesterday, Trump making this proposal about saying we have a ceasefire agreement with Israel, Hamas better accept it or they're going to get beaten up again. And this is what they do. They keep making these outrageous initiatives or orders or proposals. They often don't follow up. They often change them. But this is how the imperial colonial system works. And the Israelis and Americans are now running that system essentially single-handedly together. And it can only be beaten or ended in the long run by a combination of local resistance, regional collaboration, and international pressure. Those things take a long time to develop. And the problem for the Arabs, we don't have the leadership in the Arab world that can rise to the challenge that's needed, but we have the leadership throughout Arab society and the incredible people, and in Iran and in Turkey and in other places. So it's just a question of, unfortunately, being patient until the various assets that we have can align themselves and work together and finally bring this system down.
Yeah, well, we may have leaders in the Arab world. They just, too many of them might be in prison. But I want to say, Rami, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the international law piece. The rules of the game have just absolutely been shattered. They've never really been in place. They've never really been enforced, especially when it comes to Israel. But now it's just they're, to quote President Trump, totally obliterated, right? And no one can pretend that that's not the case anymore. And if you're, sitting in other countries around the world, thinking about the coming century of competition between the United States and China, and you see the kind of chaos that the United States seems to have to offer when it comes to global order, that doesn't seem very attractive to me, for all that can be said about, the Chinese human rights record, and there's no shortage of things that can be said, it's very hard for Washington to come, given everything that it's supported and every norm that it's destroyed and every law that it's ignored, with what Israel's been doing in Gaza and beyond, to really point that finger at anyone else and say that we offer more stability, we offer more values, and so on. I just don't see how over the long term this could possibly be good for America. And I hope that, as you know, more and more people are waking up. I do think that is correct. And hopefully, it happens sooner than later, because God knows there are way too many people who are not going to be around to see that change ultimately take place. We're hearing about a ceasefire, as you noted. We heard from, President Trump the other day that he's going to lean hard on the Israelis, and now that the Israelis have accepted a so-called 60-day ceasefire. Meanwhile, of course, it was the Israelis themselves who unilaterally broke the ceasefire agreement that President Trump had previously claimed credit for, just to return to genocide in Gaza back in March. And now what we're hearing is 60 days. We don't know quite the details yet, but during those 60 days, supposedly, the United States and its partners in the region are going to work to bring an end to the war. So nothing conclusive, still a maybe, but at best a 60-day pause. How do we make sense of this, Hanna?
Well, we also know Netanyahu is headed to Washington this Monday. And there are a number of possibilities here on the table, right? One is that they could be discussing this rumored normalization deal with, let's say, one country being floated is Syria to help expand the Abraham Accords. I find this extremely unlikely. The other is Saudi Arabia. I find them to have absolutely no incentive to do this, and also unlikely. But one never really knows in the Trump era. And then the next thing that they could be discussing would be perhaps planning for yet another attack on Iran. This is not out of the question either. What's been discussed in the last few hours is that this meeting might concern final end to the war in Gaza. And we also have found out in the last few hours that there has been some sort of proposal submitted to Hamas to review. We don't have a text of this yet. We don't have a lot of details just yet as of the time of our recording today. But we have a general understanding that what this proposal might be is essentially based on the framework of what was called the Witkoff proposal from May 29th of this year for a 60-day ceasefire, with some adjustments that are supposed to be minor and some additions. So I think for our purposes, it's worth revisiting this proposal if we're to think about where are we headed and under what circumstances could this ever end in Gaza. So we should talk about some of these details and to look at some of the sort of tensions inherent in this proposal. So the May 29th proposal pledged U.S. guarantees for Israel's adherence to the ceasefire during the 60-day period as its first point, which is interesting. It also entailed the staggered exchange of 10 living Israeli hostages for 1,111 Palestinians abducted by Israel from Gaza after October 7th, and the release of 125 Palestinian political prisoners with life sentences in Israeli prisons. And then there would be the exchange of 18 deceased Israelis for 180 deceased Palestinians from Gaza. And the plan also stipulates the immediate entry of aid into Gaza once Hamas accepts this proposal. And it would be distributed not by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, but rather the UN, the Red Crescent, and other agreed upon channels. Israel is meant to end its offenses during that period. And also would be required to end its aerial operations, so meaning aerial military movement, but also aerial surveillance, which is, aside from the security risks for Palestinians or the safety risks for Palestinians, is extremely, extremely, extremely disruptive and has been the cause of psychological distress and fatigue and these sorts of things. Not for the entirety of the day, only for 10 to 12 hours daily. The May 29th proposal also stipulates Israeli military redeployment in the northern half of Gaza. And then after one prisoner exchange on the first day, and after the next prisoner exchange that would happen on the seventh day, there would also be redeployment in the southern half of Gaza. But this proposal then leaves it to technical teams to agree on the boundaries where these redeployments would happen. But notably, important issues in this agreement are left to negotiations that are set to commence on day one of the 60-day ceasefire. And we've tried this before, and we know where this heads. Now, in theory, these negotiations for a permanent ceasefire would include the details of the Israeli redeployment map itself. So it's not agreed upon before the 60-day period begins, but you need within a week to know what that plan is, and the withdrawal from Gaza in the long term, and agreements surrounding the so-called day after, meaning who will administer Gaza. And again, during the 60-day period, parties will also negotiate these terms for a lasting ceasefire. And this is where we get our sticking point for both parties. Netanyahu has been clear time and time and again that he will only accept the total destruction of Hamas. And as he announced again today, he loves to use this phrase, he will not allow Gaza to be Hamastan. So what's implicit in the statement has more to do with the entirety of Gaza and the subject Palestinian population than it really has to do with Hamas, that it will not relinquish Gaza, that it will not withdraw, and that it will not relinquish its ability to wage all-out war on Palestinians whenever it feels like it. And for Hamas, the sticking point, as reiterated by Osama Hamdan today, is that they will not accept the continued Israeli occupation of Gaza. They must withdraw, and there must be a permanent ceasefire. Israel cannot be allowed to resume its war at any time. This is what the Palestinian negotiators have been bringing to the table every time, despite the fact that they've said time and time again that they've been quite flexible on things like the numbers of prisoners to be released and the timelines and so on and so forth. And so I think these details really should be kept in mind as Netanyahu arrives in Washington this next week. This deal itself, based on if it is to be based on the Witkoff proposal, and we have reason to believe it'll be relatively similar, but it's even more vague than past Biden proposals that failed, both for temporary ceasefires sometimes that were implemented and permanent ceasefires, especially regarding Israeli withdrawals, which is extremely sensitive. It doesn't seem to demand an Israeli withdrawal from this period, just redeployment, which does not foster optimism for the ability of this agreement to really create the conditions for a permanent ceasefire, despite the fact that Trump has said that he will guarantee this thing. And I think in a more active sense than we've ever seen in Biden plan proposals, but a lot of this has to do with the intricacies and the nuances of his own personality. But that's another matter. But there are also sort of internal Israeli complications that we really should be thinking about here. We had talked a little bit about the economic dimension and the fatigue that might come about from this. And, you know, I really do agree with what Yara said, 100%. But at the same time, there are sometimes these flashes of things that happen, like when the Israelis were, residents of the Gaza envelope were ordered to return home. Some of them were saying, well, okay, if our government is ordering us to return home, it must be safe, and therefore maybe it's time for us to end this war. Again, it has nothing to do with the ethics of the situation and more to do with, the way that it's impacting internal affairs, but be that as it may. There are other things too. In June of this month, there have been huge, defeats, let's say, for the Israeli military in Gaza. So on the one hand, they probably control 75% of the Gaza Strip. They say that through Operation Gideon's Chariot, they went from something like 60% to 70% of control of the Gaza Strip. But at the same time, in that same bloody and just destructive month for Palestinians, at least 21 Israeli soldiers were killed in Gaza. So that's a pretty marked uptick. And so we're seeing some signs and some signals that there is fatigue in Israeli society and readiness to end the war, or some growing understanding amongst officials that this war is starting to become costly, on the political system. We had already talked a little bit about the Haaretz report that came out. But there also is this tension, right? If we're to think about one of the main things that we've discussed today, which is the war on Iran, there's this tension between Netanyahu's triumphant stance following his 12-day attack. But also, on the other hand, we have the resumption of proceedings in his corruption trial. So there's an understanding that Netanyahu is refusing to end this war because his right-wing coalition would collapse, and therefore his government would collapse, and the real threat of prison time based on corruption charges would reemerge. And so in this light, this week, we saw the unprecedented interference of a U.S. president demanding of the Israeli Supreme Court that it halt its proceedings against its prime minister. And we should also remember that Trump is also in need of a win somewhere. The first 100 days of his administration passed long ago, and he's looking to claim a victory somewhere. He said he would end this thing in 24 hours, if we all remember. And now Netanyahu's opposition is targeting him and undermining his claims of victory in Iran because they don't believe that he's serious about ending the war in Gaza. And now his opposition is far more marginal than his coalition, but it's still important to note this. And that they're pointing out that he's repeatedly used his refusal for ceasefires and the continuation of this fighting to evade legal accountability within Israel. So with a viable ceasefire framework on the table, with Trump's announcements, if we were to call it that, Netanyahu's opposition do see this as a moment that would allow them to sort of place a strategic blow on Netanyahu. They see it as a chance to perhaps bring Israelis home and end the war, both hostages and soldiers, but also hold Netanyahu accountable and marginalize him in the future. And so what does this mean for Gaza? What does this mean for the future? I think so much remains to be seen, and it's changing so much by the day. But here's what we do know, is that we're in a pathetic state of affairs in which it appears that Gaza's only hope for their nightmare to end is for Netanyahu to be spared prison time. We talked about the regional front. We talked about the failure of Arab states to mobilize around this. And this is the reality, is that it's difficult to see anything else on the table right now that might end this war, except for Netanyahu being spared prison time. So the question is, what is the purpose of the international community here if this was the only path forward all along? What is the purpose of international law? What has been the purpose of these summits and these negotiations and these public statements? That we're in a situation where the chief perpetrator of a genocide must retain immunity and or stay in power, where his power was threatened because of corruption charges, so the genocide of a defenseless population can come to an end finally.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's hard to see any other way that this stops. There was the unprecedented posts from the president of the United States telling the Israeli legal system, hey, drop the charges against Netanyahu. I mean, Netanyahu is very well known for getting upset at American administrations for interfering in Israeli politics, unless, of course, it's to save his rear end from corruption charges. But it's interesting to see how this is going to play out with Trump and Netanyahu as Netanyahu comes to town. In a sense, Trump is preparing to tell Netanyahu, listen, man, you got everything you want. You got everything you want. Just do the deal already. We could do other stuff if you do. And Netanyahu's probably telling him, well, there is this one other thing that I need to kind of get taken care of. And it's this corruption trial. And everything may be hinging on that. And it is, of course, totally absurd that the defenseless people of Gaza are the ones who are paying the price for a guy who, hasn't found a law that he hasn't violated, whether it's international law or domestic Israeli law, and wants to find a way to just skirt all these charges altogether. We will keep a close eye on these things as Netanyahu comes to town to Washington, D.C., and see where things develop when it comes to the ceasefire in Gaza, and keep a close eye, of course, on the situation in Iran. Something tells me that we're not done with that just yet. Thank you so much to all of you, and a special thanks to Assal for joining us for this Hiwar episode. Good to chat as always, and we'll have questions for another day.